The wind moves differently over certain parts of this Sonoran desert. Old-timers will tell you this, their voices dropping to something quieter than the conversation requires. They'll point to patches of sand that seem no different from any other. Yet birds refuse to land there. Coyotes walk wide circles around these places. And sometimes, when the conditions align just right, human bones surface from beneath the caliche crust, arranged in positions that suggest their final moments were spent in furious, desperate digging. In 1997, a geological survey team working outside of Tubac, Arizona, made a discovery that would haunt them for years afterward. They found 17 skeletons, later carbon dated to the mid-1600s, clustered in an area no larger than a tennis court. Each skeleton's hands were positioned downward, fingers driven into the earth. But here's what made veteran forensic anthropologists pause during the examination. The finger bones showed unusual wear patterns, ground down and fractured in ways consistent with sustained repetitive digging through hard-pan soil. Several of the skeletons had reduced their fingertips to smooth stubs of bone. The expedition had died clawing at the desert floor. Clutched in the remains of leather pouches and tucked beneath rib cages were fragments of maps, drawn on treated hide, that had somehow survived the centuries. The cartography was sophisticated, detailed, marked with Spanish annotations and celestial navigation notes. Each map showed routes converging on a single location, marked with elaborate symbols representing cities of gold. Each map pointed to a slightly different destination. The conquistadors had been following guides to nowhere, and they had died without ever realizing the coordinates were meaningless. This is the legacy of Cibola. Not a city, not a treasure, but a legend that has operated like a virus in the human mind for 5 centuries, replicating itself through greed, through hope, through the fundamental flaw in our psychology that insists impossible riches must exist somewhere just beyond the horizon. The 7 cities of gold have claimed lives in every century since Coronado first heard the stories from indigenous guides in 1540. They claim lives still. The documentary evidence is fragmentary but persistent. Spanish colonial records mention dozens of expeditions that simply disappeared into the American Southwest, swallowed by distances that shouldn't have been fatal to experienced explorers. Missionary journals from the 1700s describe finding camps abandoned mid-meal, fires still burning, supplies intact, but every human being vanished. American prospectors in the 1800s left letters describing an overwhelming compulsion to reach the golden cities that pulled them away from viable claims, away from water sources, away from sense itself. Modern search and rescue teams retrieve lost hikers who speak of following sounds, following certainty, following something they cannot quite articulate but felt more real than their own thirst. And then there are the sounds. The golden rain sounds, as they've come to be called in the scattered documentation that exists. Witnesses describe them with remarkable consistency across centuries and cultures. A sound like thousands of coins falling, like metal chimes in wind that doesn't exist, like water made of something heavier and brighter pouring from an invisible source. Spanish soldiers reported it. Apache elders warned against it. Depression-era treasure hunters mentioned it in their final journal entries before they vanished. Modern audio equipment has occasionally captured something in these regions, a frequency that shouldn't be there, that seems to move independent of wind patterns or natural acoustic phenomena. In 2011, a backpacker named Michael Pritchard was found after 6 days missing in the Superstition Wilderness. He was severely dehydrated, delirious, his hiking boots worn through to the soles. He claimed he'd been following the sound of gold, falling for what felt like hours, but had apparently been days. His GPS tracker showed he'd walked in elaborate patterns, sometimes retracing the same ground multiple times, sometimes heading directly away from water sources he'd marked on his own map during the hike-in. When researchers later asked him to describe what he'd been following, he became agitated, insisting that the sound was the most real thing he'd ever experienced. More real than the researcher's voice, more real than his own heartbeat. He stopped hiking after that. He still won't discuss the specific details of what he heard. These incidents cluster around certain locations with statistical improbability. Draw the disappearances on a map, and patterns emerge, lines of attraction that pull across the desert southwest like iron filings around a magnet. The confluence points shift slightly over decades, but they're always there. Certain canyons, certain mesas, certain stretches of sand where the temperature drops 10 degrees without topographical explanation. Indigenous peoples from dozens of tribal nations have stories about these places that predate European contact by centuries. The details vary, but the warnings remain consistent. They're areas where desire becomes predatory, where something waits, where the land itself has learned to hunt using human weakness as bait. Consider the fundamental question this raises. Legends persist because they serve psychological functions, because they encode real dangers in memorable narratives. But what danger does the Cibola legend actually encode? Not the danger of empty deserts. Humans understood that long before this particular story emerged. Not the danger of greed. That's too universal and too obvious. What if the legend persists because the danger is still active? What if Cibola represents something genuine, something that exists in a form we haven't properly categorized because we've been looking for it in the wrong way? The conquistadors who died with their fingers worn to bone weren't stupid men. They were experienced explorers who had successfully navigated thousands of miles of unknown territory. What convinced them to dig in that specific spot until their bodies failed? What were they hearing or seeing or feeling that overrode every survival instinct? The maps they carried pointed nowhere, but they followed them with absolute certainty. That suggests the destination wasn't geographical. It was psychological. Or perhaps something that exists in the space where geography and psychology intersect. This documentary will follow the trail of Cibola across 5 centuries. We'll examine the deaths, the disappearances, the testimonies of those who survived encounters with whatever haunts the American Southwest. We'll listen to the audio recordings that capture sounds that shouldn't exist. We'll walk the desert where compasses spin and experienced hikers lose time. And we'll pursue a possibility that sits uncomfortable with our modern understanding of the world. What if Cibola was never meant to be found because it was never meant to reward? What if it's an ancient trap, a lure that operates on human consciousness itself, designed by intelligence we don't want to acknowledge? What if the golden cities are predatory, and they're still hungry? The desert holds its secrets in shallow graves and impossible sounds. It's time we started listening to what it's trying to tell us. Something in the Southwest has been hunting us for a very long time, and it uses our own greed as the bait we cannot resist. The desert sun had already claimed 3 men by the time the expedition began hearing the sounds. It was February of 1541, deep in the wasteland that would one day become New Mexico, and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado's grand army of conquest had become something else entirely. Something hollow, something dying. The 400 soldiers who had marched north from Mexico City 9 months earlier, gleaming in their armor and certainty, now stumbled forward as animated corpses, their eyes fixed on a horizon that promised everything and delivered only dust. But to understand how they arrived at this particular threshold of madness, we must return to where the curse truly began. Not in the desert itself, but in the fertile imagination of a Franciscan friar named Marcos de Niza, whose lies would echo through centuries. In 1539, Friar Marcos returned to Mexico City with a story that set the colonial world ablaze. He spoke of cities that dwarfed anything in Spain, of buildings 7 stories tall covered in turquoise and precious stone. He described vast wealth, populations eager for conversion, and most intoxicating of all, he spoke of gold. Walls of gold, streets that glittered with gold dust. The 7 cities of Cibola, he proclaimed, were real, and he had seen them with his own eyes from a distant hill. Every word was a fabrication. Marcos had ventured north, yes, but cautiously, fearfully. When his Moorish guide Estevanico pushed ahead to the Zuni pueblos and was killed for his arrogance and his demands, Marcos observed the settlement from miles away, turned back, and allowed his imagination to transform modest adobe structures into metropolitan wonders. Perhaps he believed he was serving God by attracting a great expedition that would bring souls to Christianity. Perhaps he simply craved significance. The truth of his motivations died with him. But his lies lived on, and they were hungry. Antonio de Mendoza, the viceroy of New Spain, assembled an expedition worthy of the treasure Marcos described. He chose Francisco Vázquez, de Coronado to lead it, a 30-year-old nobleman hungry for glory. Coronado invested his own fortune into the venture. So did his wife. Wealthy colonists mortgaged properties and sold possessions to fund the expedition, each imagining their return as conquering heroes weighted down with gold. The force that assembled at Compostela in February of 1540 numbered over 400 Spanish soldiers, more than 1,000 indigenous allies, hundreds of horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs. They brought priests to convert the multitudes, scribes to document the glory, and chains to bind the defeated. Friar Marcos rode with them, still insisting on the truth of his visions. The first months were difficult but manageable. The expedition followed established routes north through Culiacan, then pushed into territories where Spanish boots had never trod. The wilderness was vast and often hostile, but the men remained confident. They had superior weapons, horses, armor. They had conquered the Aztec Empire after all. What could desert pueblos do against Spanish steel? They reached the first of the 7 cities of Cibola in July of 1540. The Zuni pueblo of Hoiku sat on its hill, small and brown and utterly ordinary. There was no gold. The buildings were not 7 stories tall. The wealth of nations was nowhere to be found. The soldiers stood in their heavy armor under the brutal sun and stared at what their fortunes had purchased: sun-baked mud and poverty. According to expedition scribe Pedro de Castañeda, the curses directed at Friar Marcos in that moment were of a nature he could not commit to paper. Several soldiers had to be physically restrained from killing the friar on the spot. Marcos was sent back to Mexico City in disgrace, hurried away in the night, and he would spend the rest of his days in a monastery, never speaking publicly of Cibola again. But the damage was done. The expedition was already in the wilderness, already committed, already ruined financially. They could not turn back with nothing. So Coronado pushed forward. If Cibola was a disappointment, perhaps the other cities held well. The Zuni people, after a brief resistance that left several indigenous defenders dead, told the Spanish about other pueblos. Desperate men hear what they want to hear. The expedition split, sending smaller groups in different directions, searching, always searching. It was during these scattered wanderings that the pattern emerged, the template that would repeat across centuries. First came the reports of something strange on the horizon. Soldiers swore they saw cities in the distance that shimmered and moved. Not mirages, they insisted, but actual structures that seemed to shift position with the sun's journey across the sky. Pedro de Castañeda wrote of multiple sightings of what the men called ciudades que caminan, the walking cities. Buildings that appeared at dawn in one location would be miles away by dusk. Then came the sounds. This is where the journals become truly disturbing. Multiple sources, written by different men who had no contact with each other after the expedition scattered, described the same phenomenon. They heard bells. Not the bells of churches or missions, nothing familiar or comforting. These were sounds like glass chimes, like crystal striking crystal, like what one soldier described as the sound golden rain would make falling upon the rooftops of paradise. The sounds came at night mostly. They seemed to emanate from the empty desert, from the darkness beyond the campfires. Some men claimed they could follow the sounds, that the chiming moved through the wilderness just ahead of them, always receding, never quite reachable. Those who wandered after the celestial music were often found days later, if they were found at all. Their bodies showed no signs of violence, but their faces, witnesses reported, were frozen in expressions of profound wonder and equally profound terror. The death toll began to climb. Thirst took many. The expedition's route had been planned around Marcos's false geography, and they found themselves in regions where water was scarce and hostile indigenous groups knew how to use the land as a weapon. Starvation followed. The livestock was slaughtered and consumed. Then the dogs. Then the horses, despite how much the cavalry treasured their mounts. By winter of 1540 to 1541, the expedition had fractured entirely. Different groups wandered in different directions, chasing rumors of wealthy kingdoms that always lay just beyond the next ridge, the next river valley. Coronado himself led a group onto the Great Plains, guided by an indigenous slave the Spanish called El Turco, who promised them the wealthy kingdom of Quivira. The plains broke them. Endless grass and sky, and nothing else. No landmarks, no clear paths, just horizon in every direction. Men went mad from the emptiness. The journals from this period become increasingly disturbed. Rational military men begin describing visions. They see armies in the clouds. They report that the stars are watching them with malevolent intelligence. One scribe writes of waking to find half his company, standing in perfect formation in the darkness, staring north, all of them claiming they heard a great bell summoning them home, though none of them could agree on what home meant anymore. This is when the whispers of cannibalism begin. The official records are carefully silent on the subject, but between the lines, in marginal notes and in testimony given years later, the truth seeps through. Men disappeared from camps, and the survivors would not meet each other's eyes. Cooking fires burned when there was no game to cook. One soldier, giving confession to a priest, 2 decades after the expedition, spoke of meat we pretended came from animals, though we all knew the truth, and we ate anyway, because the alternative was joining the meal. El Turco, who had promised them Quivira, was executed when Coronado finally realized he had been leading them in circles, whether from malice or because he himself was lost. They strangled him quietly, and some of the men whispered that portions of his body went missing before burial, though no official record confirms this. What they found when they finally reached Quivira in the summer of 1541 was, once again, not a golden city but a modest settlement of the Wichita people. Grass houses and ordinary life. The wealth of nations remained a fantasy. Coronado was injured during the expedition when he fell from his horse during a race. The accounts disagree on the exact nature of the injury, but what is clear is that he was never the same afterward. Some sources suggest a severe head wound. Others hint at something more mysterious, a change in his fundamental nature that the physical injury merely symbolized. The expedition limped back to Mexico City in 1542. Of the 400 Spanish soldiers who had marched north, barely 100 returned. Of the 1,000 indigenous allies, the losses were even more catastrophic. They brought back no gold, no wealth, no glory. Many returned to find their families destitute, their properties seized by creditors. Coronado himself faced an investigation into his conduct, was stripped of his governorship, and spent his remaining years in obscurity and poverty, his health shattered, his reputation destroyed. But it is what he said in his final years that matters most to our story. Multiple witnesses reported that Coronado, when the fever was on him, would speak of the cities he had seen. Not the disappointing pueblos, but something else. He described towers that touched the sky, streets paved with light instead of stone, and inhabitants who were not quite human. He insisted that he had seen them, these impossible cities, but they had moved away from him. They had walked with the sun, he said, always staying just beyond reach, and the bells he heard were the sounds of their passing. The music of wonders that mortals were not meant to possess. He died in 1554, broken in body and mind, still occasionally murmuring about golden rain and walking cities. The curse was born here, in the gap between promise and reality, in the space where golden dreams turned to dust and death. Every element that would repeat in future disasters was present in Coronado's expedition. The irresistible lure of gold that drew reasonable men into unreasonable risks. The strange sensory phenomena, the sounds and sights that defied explanation, that suggested something in the desert was actively deceiving them. And finally, the inevitable descent into madness and death, the way hope curdled into horror. The walking cities Coronado described became legend. The celestial chimes were whispered about in taverns and missions across New Spain, and every subsequent expedition into the northern wilderness carried with it the shadow of Coronado's failure. They went anyway. They always went anyway, because the desert, it seemed, knew exactly what bait to use. It knew the human heart was vulnerable to glittering promises, and it had patience enough to wait for the next group of seekers, the next wave of men willing to trade their lives and sanity for a glimpse of golden cities that moved with the sun. The template was set. The curse was awake, and it was hungry for more. The Sonoran Desert holds its breath in the hours before dawn, when the heat of yesterday still rises from the stones and the cold of night settles like water in the low places. It was in such an hour in the spring of 1539, that Estevanico the Moor walked ahead of his Spanish masters for the last time, his shadow stretching long across sand that had never known European feet. History remembers him by many names: Estevanico, Esteban, Stephen the Black, the first African to explore the American Southwest. But the Zuni people, in their pueblos of ancient stone, remember him differently. They remember him as the man who heard the sound, the man who brought the sickness, the man who could not be allowed to reach their sacred places, no matter the cost. Estevanico was born Mustafa Azemari in the Moroccan town of Izemir, sometime around 1500. His freedom ended when Portuguese raiders swept through the coastal regions, and he was sold into slavery, eventually becoming the property of a Spanish nobleman named Andrés Dorante de Carranza. In 1528, Estevanico accompanied his master on the doomed Narvaez expedition to Florida, a venture that would transform him from property into legend. Of the 600 men who set out on that expedition, only 4 survived the 8-year ordeal that followed. Estevanico was one of them. He and his companions walked thousands of miles across the unmapped territories of what would become Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. They survived by their wits, by luck, and according to the indigenous peoples they encountered, by something that looked very much like magic. The 4 survivors gained reputations as healers, shamans who could cure the sick with touch and prayer. Estevanico, fluent in multiple languages and possessing what the Spanish called an uncommon gift for understanding native tongues, became the primary negotiator and scout. But something changed in him during those years. The other survivors would later speak of it carefully, obliquely, as men do when they fear to name a thing directly. They said Estevanico became obsessed with the stories the indigenous peoples told them. Stories of 7 cities to the north, cities with walls of turquoise and streets that gleamed like water. Cities where gold was so common that children played with it as if it were clay. The Spanish called these mythical places the 7 cities of Cibola. To the conquistadors fresh from plundering the Aztec and Inca empires, these tales were like air to drowning men. New Spain's viceroy Antonio de Mendoza heard the rumors and organized an expedition. But first, he needed intelligence. He needed someone expendable, someone who could move ahead of the main force and assess the situation. He needed Estevanico. Technically, Estevanico was no longer a slave by this time. Technically, he served as a guide by choice, working under the command of Fray Marcos de Niza, a Franciscan priest who would lead the preliminary expedition. But choice is a complicated word when your alternatives are limited, and your survival depends on the goodwill of men who consider you property by nature, if not by law. In March of 1539, Fray Marcos and Estevanico departed from Culiacan in western Mexico, heading north with a small party of indigenous guides and servants. The arrangement was simple. Estevanico would range ahead, several days' journey in advance, sending back messengers with crosses of varying sizes. A small cross meant nothing remarkable. A large cross meant he had found something significant. A cross as tall as a man meant he had found the cities of gold. Within weeks, Estevanico sent back a cross that required 2 men to carry it. The priest's letters, preserved in the archives of the Indies in Seville, describe what happened next with the careful language of a man trying to explain something he does not fully understand. Fray Marcos wrote that Estevanico became strange in those final weeks. He adorned himself with feathers and bells, and turquoise jewelry given to him by the tribes through whose lands he passed. He carried a decorated gourd rattle, a gift from his healing days, which he used as a symbol of authority. The indigenous peoples who traveled with him seemed both drawn to and frightened of him, according to the priest's account. They followed him, but they followed at a distance, and Estevanico began to speak of a sound. In a letter that would not reach Spanish authorities until months after the events it described, Fray Marcos wrote that Estevanico claimed to hear rain when there were no clouds. Rain that fell only for him. Rain that no one else could perceive. But not the soft sound of water on earth. Something else. Something he described as rain made of coins. Thousands of golden coins falling from an invisible sky, creating a sound like wind chimes made from all the wealth of heaven. The priest wrote that he tried to catch up with his scout, troubled by reports filtering back from the indigenous guide. They said Estevanico walked for hours without stopping, his head tilted as if listening to something just beyond the edge of hearing. They said he barely slept, that he would stand at night facing north, toward where the cities were supposed to lie, his body swaying slightly as if to music. The indigenous peoples, through whose territories Estevanico passed, had mixed reactions to this strange figure. Some welcomed him as they had before, remembering his reputation as a healer. Others turned him away, disturbed by something in his manner, something in his eyes. One group of guides deserted entirely, walking back south to meet Fray Marcos on the trail. They told the priest that Estevanico had the gold sickness, that he was touched, that he needed to be stopped before he brought his curse to the sacred places. The gold sickness. The Spanish knew this term well, though they rarely acknowledged how accurate it was. They had seen it in their own conquistadors, had seen how the sight of indigenous gold transformed reasonable soldiers into madmen, willing to torture, murder, and enslave for one more ingot, one more mass, one more golden cup. But the indigenous peoples understood the sickness differently. They saw it not as mere greed, but as a spiritual disease, a poison that entered through the eyes and ears and consumed a person from within. A curse that spread like plague through anyone it touched. The Zuni people call their main pueblo Halona, the middle place. It sits where it has sat for over 1,000 years, built and rebuilt on the same sacred ground. In mid-May of 1539, Estevanico approached Holku, one of the Zuni pueblos that the Spanish had convinced themselves must be the legendary Cibola. He came adorned with feathers and rattles, accompanied by the remaining guides and servants who had not deserted him, sending messengers ahead with his decorated gourd to announce his arrival. The Zuni elders examined the gourd and refused him entry. What happened next depends on which history you read. The Spanish accounts say that Estevanico, arrogant and demanding, insisted on entering the pueblo, that he claimed powers and authority he did not possess, that he demanded tribute and women, and the Zuni, offended by this impudence from a black-skinned stranger, killed him to defend their honor and their families. But the Zuni oral histories tell a different story, one that has been passed down through generations with the careful precision that oral cultures reserve for important truth. According to these accounts, the elders recognized immediately what Estevanico carried, not in his hands or his packs, but inside him. They saw the sickness. They heard, some claim, the faint echo of the sound that followed him, though they describe it differently than he did. Where Estevanico heard coins of gold, they heard the sound of something breaking, something sacred being shattered piece by piece. The Zuni claim they tried to turn him away peacefully. They told him to return south, to go back to his masters, to leave their lands before what followed him could take root. But Estevanico, driven by the sound only he could fully hear, could not turn back. He had come too far. He had heard too much. The sound of rain made from coins pulled him forward as surely as a rope around his neck. So the warriors did what had to be done. They killed him outside the pueblo walls, and they killed most of those who traveled with him, to stop the sickness from spreading. Then they burned the bodies and scattered the ashes in 4 directions, the sacred number, to break the curse. A few survivors escaped to warn Fray Marcos, who approached close enough to glimpse Hawiku from a distance before prudence overcame ambition. He returned to Mexico City and reported, somewhat dishonestly, that he had seen the cities of Cibola with his own eyes, and that they were as magnificent as the legends promised. His lies would help launch the full-scale Coronado expedition the following year, which would find only modest pueblos, no gold, and considerable resistance from peoples who had learned from Estevanico's fate what Spanish interest in their lands would mean. But this is where the story becomes more than history. This is where it becomes something that lingers. Dr. Edmund Ladd was a Zuni anthropologist and historian who served as both curator of ethnology and deputy assistant director for public programs at the National Museum of Natural History. Before his death in 2010, he spoke carefully about what the Zuni call atsina, the sound that hunts. He said that the tribal elders maintain that certain places in their land still carry traces of what Estevanico brought with him. That on still nights, when the air is dry and the stars are especially bright, some people claim to hear something like wind chimes in the distance, something like coins falling on stone, something that makes you want to walk toward it, to follow it, to find its source. He said that the elders warn younger tribal members never to follow that sound, that it is not meant for human ears, that it is the echo of a sickness that has no cure, only victims. Modern Zuni spiritual leaders, when pressed by researchers and anthropologists, acknowledge the existence of these stories but refuse to elaborate in detail. They particularly refuse to discuss anything related to Cibola after the sun goes down. This is not superstition in the dismissive sense that outsiders often mean the term. This is a cultural protocol based on centuries of careful observation and experience. Some stories, the elders maintain, become more powerful when spoken in darkness. Some words should only be said in daylight, when their potential to harm is diminished by the sun. There are protocols for this, rules passed down through generations. You do not speak of Atsina directly. You do not name it fully. You do not discuss the details of what happened to the man who heard it, especially not in the dark months, when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds grows thin. Because the Zuni understanding, the one preserved in their oral histories and spiritual practices, is that Estevanico's death solved nothing. The sickness that consumed him, the sound that drew him north to his doom, did not die with him. How could it? The gold was still in the ground. The Spanish were still coming. The curse that Estevanico carried was not personal but civilizational, the leading edge of a wave of greed and destruction that would wash over the southwest for centuries to come. In this interpretation, the Zuni warriors who killed Estevanico were not defending their honor from an arrogant slave. They were performing a desperate act of spiritual protection, trying to stop a plague before it could fully arrive. They failed, of course. Coronado came the next year with an army. The Spanish missions followed. The gold sickness spread exactly as they feared it would, transforming the Southwest into a battleground that claimed countless lives and destroyed cultures that had flourished for thousands of years. But perhaps they delayed it. Perhaps by stopping Estevanico, by refusing to let him lead his masters directly to their doors, the Zuni bought time to prepare, to protect what could be protected, to hide what could be hidden. The sound remains, according to those who claim to know. Not everywhere, not always, but in certain places where the gold sickness took root and never fully released its grip, where the earth still remembers what men were willing to do for the promise of wealth, where the wind on certain nights carries the faint whisper of rain that falls only in dreams, rain made from all the cursed gold that men have killed for across the centuries. The Zuni still will not discuss these things after dark. They still teach their children the protocols, the proper way to speak of dangerous subjects, the importance of respecting the boundaries between what should be known and what should be left alone. Because some sounds, once heard, can never be unheard, and some sicknesses have no cure, only quarantine. The heat shimmered across the Malpais Badlands of New Mexico in the summer of 1933, distorting the jagged black volcanic rock into something that seemed almost alive. It was here, in one of the most inhospitable landscapes in the American Southwest, that Dr. Harold Warren led his expedition into terrain that locals called curse. The Malpais, Spanish for Badlands, had earned its reputation honestly. Miles upon miles of ancient lava flows created a labyrinth of razor-sharp formations that could shred boots and skin alike. But Warren wasn't interested in the warnings. He was chasing gold. Dr. Harold Warren was no amateur. At 42 years old, he had built a respectable career as an archaeologist with credentials from Yale and field experience across 3 continents. His team consisted of 3 other members: Thomas Blackwell, a geologist from Colorado with a talent for finding precious metals; Margaret Chen, a photographer and ethnographer who documented indigenous cultures of the Southwest; and James Dutton, Warren's former student and the expedition's technical specialist. Dutton had brought along something unusual for 1933, primitive audio recording equipment that weighed nearly 70 pounds and required careful handling across the treacherous terrain. The expedition departed from Socorro on June 15, 1933. Their stated purpose was to investigate rumors of Spanish gold mines lost somewhere in the Malpais region, mines that supposedly predated the American territorial period by centuries. Warren had spent 2 years researching archival documents in Mexico City and Madrid, piecing together fragments of conquistador journals that referenced a place called La Lluvia de Oro, the rain of gold. Most historians dismiss these accounts as fantasy, the fever dreams of men driven mad by greed and heat. Warren believed otherwise. For the first 2 weeks, the expedition sent regular updates via a runner who made the journey back to Socorro every 3 days. These early reports were professional and optimistic. Warren described finding what appeared to be worked stone markers, possibly indicating old Spanish trails. Blackwell noted unusual mineral concentrations in certain rock formations. Chen photographed petroglyphs that seemed different from known indigenous patterns in the region. Nothing in these communications suggested anything amiss. The shift began in Warren's report from July 2nd. The tone remained scientific, but a new element had entered their work. Dutton had been experimenting with his recording equipment, attempting to capture ambient sounds of the desert at different times of day. On the night of June 30th, he recorded something that the team found remarkable. Warren described it in his written report as a rhythmic metallic precipitation sound, almost musical in nature, emanating from somewhere within the deeper lava tubes to our east. The team became focused on this sound. Warren's next report, dated July 7th, devoted 3 full pages to describing their attempts to locate the source. They had moved their camp closer to the area where the sound seemed strongest. Dutton had made multiple recordings, and Warren noted that the sound appeared to follow a pattern, though they couldn't yet decipher its meaning. More troubling was Warren's description of the sound itself, which had shifted from scientific observation to something more personal. He wrote that listening to the recordings induced a state of profound calm, as though one were being gently pulled towards sleep while rain fell on a tin roof. Except this rain sounded distinctly metallic, like gold coins dropping slowly onto brass. That was the last written report Socorro received. The runner who delivered it said the camp seemed normal, though he noticed all 4 expedition members were wearing headphones connected to Dutton's recording equipment when he arrived. They barely acknowledged his presence, he later told authorities. When he left, they were still sitting in a circle, listening. 2 weeks of silence passed before concern turned to alarm. A search party departed Socorro on July 26th. Hawaii. What they found 3 days later would become one of the most perplexing mysteries in New Mexico history. The expedition's camp stood intact in a small clearing surrounded by black lava rock. The tents were properly erected, supplies neatly organized, water containers full. But the arrangement of objects within the camp defied explanation. Every piece of gold hunting equipment the team had brought, every pan, every pick, every screening device, had been arranged in a perfect circle, approximately 30 feet in diameter. At the exact center of this circle sat Dutton's recording device, still running, still playing. The searchers later reported that the sound emanating from the machine was unlike anything they had heard before. Some described it as beautiful. Others found it deeply unsettling. One searcher, a rancher named Miguel Cortez, refused to approach within 50 yards of the device. He claimed the sound made him feel as though his thoughts were being pulled out of his head like golden thread. The recording itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. When the equipment was finally shut off and transported back to Socorro, experts attempted to analyze the wax cylinders Dutton had used. The quality was poor by modern standards, even by the standards of 1933, but the sound was unmistakable. A rhythmic pattern, metallic and sharp, with an underlying resonance that seemed to pulse at a frequency just below normal hearing. Some listeners reported feeling nauseated after extended exposure. Others became deeply relaxed, almost hypnotized. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators found Dutton's field notebook near the recording device. The last several pages contained transcriptions of Warren's verbal recordings, notes made while listening to the mysterious sound. The entries grew progressively stranger and more fragmented. On July 10th, Warren had dictated, "The sound originates from deep below, perhaps in chambers the lava flows created centuries ago. Blackwell believes there may be actual gold deposits causing some form of acoustic resonance. We must find the source." By July 14th, Warren's notes had deteriorated into something barely coherent, beautiful. "It calls us down. Margaret won't remove the headphones anymore. Says she can see the gold when she listens. Golden rain falling up through the earth. We understand now what the Spanish meant. Not mines. Never mines. The gold itself is singing. The final entry, dated July 18th, consisted of a single sentence repeated over and over, filling 3 pages in increasingly erratic handwriting. We found it, but it found us first. Of Dr. Harold Warren and his 3 colleagues, there was no sign. The search expanded across the Malpais region. Dozens of volunteers combed the lava fields, searched the caves and tubes, called out until their voices gave out. Nothing. It was as if 4 human beings had simply evaporated, leaving behind their possessions arranged in that inexplicable circle around a machine endlessly playing a sound that shouldn't exist. The story might have ended there, filed away as a tragic mystery of the desert, except for what happened years later. In 1938, a rancher in Arizona found a woman wandering near his property. She was severely dehydrated, sunburned, and disoriented, but alive. She was Margaret Chen. She had no identification, could barely speak, and seemed unaware of where she had been or how she had gotten there. When authorities finally identified her and asked about the expedition, her eyes went distant. "We found it," she whispered, "but it found us first." She could provide no other information. Medical examinations revealed she was in surprisingly good health, given her ordeal, but she had apparently lost 5 years of memory. She knew her name, her family, her education, but everything from June of 1933 onward was simply gone. Thomas Blackwell turned up in 1941, discovered by police in Denver living on the streets. Like Chen, he appeared physically healthy but mentally shattered. His memory loss was identical, a clean break starting from the expedition. When shown photographs of the camp, the recording equipment, the circle of tools, he showed no recognition. But when investigators played a portion of the mysterious recording for him, his reaction was immediate and violent. He began screaming, covering his ears, repeating the same phrase Chen had used. "We found it, but it found us first." James Dutton never returned. Despite extensive searches, no trace of him or Dr. Harold Warren has ever been found. Chen lived until 1967, dying in a psychiatric facility in California. She never recovered any memory of what happened in the Malpais. Blackwell disappeared again in 1943 and was never seen after that. The recording equipment and the wax cylinders were seized by authorities and reportedly stored in a government facility. Researchers who claimed to have heard the recordings in the 1950s reported experiencing severe headaches and disorientation. By the 1960s, the cylinders had apparently been destroyed or lost, depending on which official account you believe. What really happened to the Warren expedition? The rational explanations are unsatisfying but plausible. Heat exposure, dehydration, and isolation could have induced mass hysteria or group psychosis. The mysterious sound might have been nothing more than wind passing through the complex lava tube systems, creating acoustic effects that the team, in their weakened state, interpreted as something supernatural. The perfect circle of equipment could have been an attempt to create some kind of signal for rescuers, arranged during the early stages of mental deterioration. Chen and Blackwell's memory loss could be explained as dissociative amnesia, the mind protecting itself from traumatic experiences too painful to remember. But these explanations don't account for everything. They don't explain why experienced, educated professionals would abandon safety protocols so completely. They don't explain the consistency of Chen and Blackwell's fragmented memories, the identical phrase both repeated. They don't explain why both survivors reacted with such terror to elements of their experience, while simultaneously having no conscious memory of what occurred. And they certainly don't explain what happened to Warren and Dutton, whose bodies were never recovered despite extensive searches of the surrounding area. The Malpais still stretches across central New Mexico, a landscape unchanged since 1933. The exact location of Warren's camp has been lost to time and the deliberate vagueness of official reports. Some researchers claim to have identified possible sites based on geographical clues in the surviving documents, but none have been confirmed. Local guides still tell stories about the lost gold expedition, usually to tourists seeking ghost stories around campfires. They speak of sounds in the deep lava tubes, metallic and rhythmic, like rain falling on precious metal. They warn against listening too closely to the desert's hidden voices. Most importantly, they caution that some things, once found, can never be unfound. The human mind craves patterns, seeks meaning in chaos, and yearns to solve mysteries. The Warren expedition denies us all three. We want to know what they found, what drove them to madness or transcendence, or whatever fate claimed them. We want to understand the sound that obsessed them so completely. Most of all, we want to believe there's a rational explanation that lets us file this story away and sleep soundly. But sometimes the desert keeps its secrets. Sometimes all we're left with is a warning in the form of a riddle. They found it, but it found them first, and we still don't know what it was. In the late summer of 2016, a YouTube creator named Sarah Chen uploaded what she thought would be a simple sleep aid video. She had spent 3 nights camping in the Sonoran Desert near the Arizona-New Mexico border, recording what she called ambient rain sounds mixed with wind chimes she had hung from saguaro, cacti. She titled it Desert Gold Rain 10 Hours because the chimes, cheap brass things she had bought at a flea market, created a sound she described as golden and soothing. Within 6 weeks, the video had accumulated over 2 million views. Within 3 months, Sarah had deleted her entire channel and refused to speak publicly about what happened next. The phenomenon started innocuously enough, buried in the comment sections that sleep video creators rarely read thoroughly. User after user began reporting the same experience. Vivid dreams of 7 cities made entirely of gold, shimmering in desert heat, always just beyond reach. At first, Sarah dismissed these comments as coincidence or the power of suggestion. People who listen to sleep sounds often report unusual dreams, she told herself. But then the messages started arriving in her personal email, dozens of them, then hundreds. They were longer, more detailed, more disturbing. People described walking through the same streets in their dreams, seeing the same architectural details, encountering the same figures cloaked in Spanish conquistador armor that seemed to move with impossible fluidity. A user named Marcus Thompson from Portland sent Sarah a 15-page document detailing his dreams across 43 consecutive nights. He described specific buildings, specific doorways, specific symbols carved into golden walls. He had never heard of Cibola, never studied Spanish colonial history, never read about Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. Yet his descriptions matched historical accounts of the legendary 7 cities of gold with uncanny precision. He included sketches, measurements, even architectural diagrams. At the end of his document, Marcus wrote that he had liquidated his savings account and was driving to New Mexico to find what he called the resonance point. Sarah never heard from him again. She was not the only content creator experiencing this pattern. Between 2016 and 2019, at least 8 different YouTube channels and 3 meditation apps featured ambient recordings made in Southwest desert locations, particularly in areas spanning from central Arizona through New Mexico. The creators had never communicated with each other, never collaborated, never even knew of each other's existence until much later. Some recorded actual rain, others synthesized sounds, still others mixed field recordings with musical elements. What they shared was geography. They had all recorded or claimed to record in remote desert locations within a 100-mile radius of the historical Cibola search sites. The shared dream reports followed a predictable pattern. It would start after 3 to 5 nights of listening to the recordings. First came fragmentary images, golden walls, desert sunsets that seemed to last for hours, shadows that moved against the light. Then the dreams became more cohesive, more narrative. Dreamers reported walking through complete cities, interacting with other dreamers, though they appeared as translucent figures. They described meeting each other in these dream spaces, comparing notes, and incredibly, finding that their experiences aligned. 2 users from different countries reported having a conversation in the dream space, then verified specific details with each other after waking. They had never met, never spoken, had no connection except listening to the same 10-hour video. Dr. Lisa Ramirez, a sleep psychologist at the University of Arizona, who began investigating these reports in 2017, documented over 300 cases of shared dream phenomena connected to these specific recordings. Her research, which remains unpublished and disputed by her academic peers, suggested something she termed audio-induced collective unconscious activation. In interviews, She struggled to explain the mechanism, eventually falling back on theories about low-frequency sound waves, geographical magnetic anomalies, and what she reluctantly called place memory imprinted in sound. Nabdiu Nimi. But the dreams were only the beginning of the pattern. Between January of 2017 and August of 2019, at least 12 people disappeared in the southwest desert regions after becoming obsessed with these recordings. They left behind emptied bank accounts, abandoned jobs, and confused families. Some left notes describing a calling, a pull, a certainty that they needed to reach specific coordinates in the desert. 3 of them were found alive but profoundly changed, speaking in fragmented sentences about cities that exist between frequencies and gold that sings in a range humans forgot how to hear. 9 remain missing. Search and rescue teams found campsites, abandoned vehicles, and in 2 cases, phones with voice memos that consisted only of hours of the person humming a melody no one could identify. Sarah Chen agreed to speak with me on the condition that I would not reveal her current location or her real name. Sarah Chen is a pseudonym. We met in a coffee shop in a city she asked me not to name, and she brought with her a folder of printed emails, screenshots, and handwritten notes she had kept despite deleting everything digital. Her hands shook as she showed me photographs of 5 people who had contacted her. 5 people who had told her they were traveling to New Mexico to find the source of the sound. 5 people who had not been heard from since. I was just trying to make relaxing content, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper. I hung some wind chimes in the desert, recorded the ambient sound, added some rain I had recorded in Oregon, and mixed it together. That's all. I didn't go to any special location. I didn't know about the Cibola legend. I had never heard of Coronado or the 7 cities of gold until people started commenting about them. She showed me a message from a woman named Jennifer Hartley, a 34-year-old accountant from Ohio. Jennifer had written to Sarah, explaining that she had listened to the Desert Gold Rain video every night for 6 weeks. She described dreams of impossible beauty and terrible longing. She wrote that she had withdrawn $12,000 from her retirement account and was driving to coordinates that had appeared in her dreams, coordinates she believed would lead her to the 7th city, the one they never found, because it exists in the space between hearing and understanding. Jennifer's car was found 3 weeks later on a dirt road 40 miles outside of Albuquerque. Her phone, wallet, and identification were inside. She was not. Audio forensics experts who examined the recordings found something that should not exist. Dr. Michael Torres, who spent 20 years working in acoustic analysis for the FBI before moving into private consulting, analyzed 7 different recordings from various creators. He found what he called an inexplicable low-frequency pattern, a rhythmic pulse occurring at approximately 7 Hz, right at the threshold of human hearing. This frequency appeared in recordings made near historical Cibola search sites, even when the creators used entirely different equipment, recording techniques, and even in synthesized sounds that should not contain such pattern. Here's what keeps me up at night, Dr. Torres explained during our interview. This frequency pattern shouldn't exist naturally in these recordings. It's too regular, too consistent, too precisely calibrated, but it also doesn't appear to be added artificially. It's as if the location itself is generating this frequency, and any recording device used in these specific areas captures it, whether the person realizes it or not. I've recorded sound in hundreds of locations worldwide. I've never encountered anything like this. Liwa. The 7 Hz frequency is significant in neurological terms. It sits at the border between theta and alpha brain waves, the state associated with deep meditation, hypnagogic hallucination, and what some researchers call heightened suggestibility. Prolonged exposure to sounds containing this frequency can potentially alter consciousness, create vivid mental imagery, and according to some disputed studies, even facilitate what appears to be shared psychological experiences among listeners. Other creators began deleting their content. A meditation app called Desert Tranquility removed an entire series of sleep soundscapes after their customer service department received over 400 complaints about disturbing dreams and obsessive thoughts. An ASMR creator known as Whispering Sands shut down her channel after her boyfriend reported that she had started sleepwalking, drawing elaborate maps of cities that didn't exist, speaking in her sleep about gold that remembers everyone who sought it, and still calls to them across centuries. The pattern suggested something beyond mass hysteria or suggestion. The people affected came from different countries, different backgrounds, different belief systems. Many had no prior interest in legends, folklore, or the supernatural. They were simply looking for something to help them sleep. Yet they reported remarkably consistent experiences. The 7 cities, the golden architecture, the sense of being called to specific locations in the southwest desert, and most disturbing, the feeling that something in those recordings recognized them, knew them, and wanted them to come searching. By late 2019, most of the original recordings had been deleted, either by the creators themselves or by YouTube following reports. But copies circulated on file-sharing sites, Reddit threads, and obscure forums. People continued to download them, continued to listen, continued to report the dreams. Some actively sought them out, believing the recordings contained hidden knowledge or doorways to altered states of consciousness. Others stumbled upon them accidentally, unaware of the history, unaware of the pattern, unaware that they were listening to something that seemed to listen back. Sarah Chen told me that she still hears from people, even years after deleting her channel. They find her through indirect connections, mutual acquaintances, persistent searching. They want to know where exactly she recorded the sound. They want the original files. They want coordinates. She refuses every request, but she keeps track of them in a private document. The last time she checked, over 90 people had contacted her seeking this information. She wonders how many of them will eventually go searching anyway, drawn by dreams of golden cities that 7 conquistador expeditions couldn't find. Cities that might exist not in physical space, but in the frequency between sound and silence, between hearing and being heard, between searching and being found. The last thing Marcus Webb's camera recorded was the sound of footsteps moving away through dead leaves, growing fainter, swallowed by the darkness of the San Mateo Mountains. But the camera kept rolling. For 6 hours and 14 minutes, it recorded nothing but a sound that shouldn't exist. Marcus was 22 years old when he disappeared in October of 2018. He was a senior at New Mexico State University, majoring in audio engineering with a minor in folklore studies. An unusual combination, but it made perfect sense to anyone who knew him. Marcus ran a podcast called Frequency and Fiction, where he investigated supposedly supernatural sounds by debunking them with science. He had episodes on the Taos hum, the Seneca guns, and the Windsor hum. His approach was methodical, almost surgical. He would travel to locations, set up professional recording equipment, capture the sounds in question, and then break them down in his campus studio until he found the rational explanation. Industrial equipment. Atmospheric conditions. Mass hysteria. There was always an answer. The gold rain phenomenon had fascinated him since his sophomore year. He'd written a term paper on it, tracing the legend back through decades of reported encounters in the San Mateo Range. He'd corresponded with Dr. Patricia Caldwell, the folklorist who had compiled the most comprehensive database of witness testimonies. She had warned him, actually warned him in an email that his sister later provided to investigators. The email said, and I'm quoting here, "Marcus, I appreciate your scientific rigor, but please reconsider going alone. Every serious investigator who's pursued this has either found nothing or come back changed. One didn't come back at all." I'm referring to James Whitmore from the 1967 UCLA expedition. We never recovered his body. Marcus had written back thanking her for the concern, but explaining that isolation was crucial. He needed to eliminate all possibility of contamination in his recording. No other voices, no other footsteps, no electrical interference from other people's devices. He would hike in alone, set up camp in the Red Canyon area where the highest concentration of reports originated, and spend 4 days recording. He had a satellite emergency beacon. He had cold weather gear. He had enough food for a week. He'd been hiking these mountains since high school. His family later said he was experienced, prepared, cautious by nature. What Marcus didn't anticipate was what those 4 days would do to his mind. We have his footage. All of it. Marcus had brought 3 devices, a high-end digital video camera, a professional audio recorder with studio-quality microphones, and his smartphone as backup. He filmed video diary entries every day, documenting his process. The transformation we witness across those 4 days is devastating to watch, like witnessing someone slowly disappear before they ever leave the frame. Day 1, October 9th, 2018. Marcus sets up camp in a clearing surrounded by ponderosa pines. He's energetic, smiling at the camera as he explains his equipment setup. He's placed microphones in a wide array around his campsite, each one calibrated to capture different frequency ranges. He talks about his hypothesis, that the gold rain sound is likely caused by wind patterns moving through the unique geology of the canyon, possibly interacting with quartz deposits in the rock face. His voice is confident, almost playful. He makes a joke about finally putting this local legend to bed. The footage shows him eating freeze-dried camping food, reading a paperback book by headlamp, settling into his sleeping bag as full darkness falls. Nothing unusual, just a college student on a solo camping trip. Day 2 is when things begin to shift. Marcus wakes at dawn and immediately checks his recording equipment. He's excited but trying to stay calm as he speaks to the camera. During the night, around 2:17 in the morning, according to the timestamp, his microphones picked up something. He plays it back for the camera, holding his recorder close to the built-in mic so we can hear. It's faint, but unmistakable. A cascading sound, like rain but with a metallic quality, almost musical. It lasted for 7 minutes and 32 seconds. Marcus is thrilled. He talks rapidly about frequency analysis he'll do later, about ruling out wildlife sounds and wind patterns. But there's something else in his voice now, something underneath the excitement. An edge of obsession beginning to form. He says he's going to stay up tonight, awake and alert, so he can witness the phenomenon directly if it occurs again. He wants to see if there's a visual component. The Day 2 night footage is harder to watch. Marcus sits in his camp chair, staring out into the darkness beyond his small circle of lamplight. He has headphones on, connected to his microphone array, listening in real time for any anomalies. The camera is on a tripod, filming him from the side. For long stretches, nothing happens. He just sits there, completely still, headphones covering his ears. But around 11:43 at night, something changes. His posture shifts. He leans forward slightly. His hand comes up to adjust the headphones, pressing them tighter against his head. And then he starts to cry. Not sobs, just tears running down his face while his expression remains almost neutral, transfixed. He sits like that for 19 minutes before finally removing the headphones and turning to the camera. He doesn't wipe the tears away. He says, "It's not what I expected. It's not geological. It's organized. There's structure to it. Patterns. I need better equipment. I need to isolate the individual layers. There's something underneath the surface sound, something I almost caught." His voice is hoarse, strained. Day 3. Marcus looks terrible. He clearly hasn't slept. His eyes are bloodshot, his movements jerky and unfocused. But he's working with manic intensity, repositioning his microphones, adjusting levels, talking to himself in a constant mutter that the camera barely picks up. When he does sit down to record a proper video diary entry, his hands shake as he holds the camera. He talks about the layered structure of the sound, how it operates on multiple frequencies simultaneously. Some of it is in the audible range, but he's discovered there are infrasonic and ultrasonic components as well, vibrations below and above normal human hearing. He's managed to shift those into audible frequencies using his audio software, and that's when he found what he calls the pulse. He doesn't explain what he means by that. He just keeps saying, "There's a pulse underneath everything. A rhythm. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. You feel it more than hear it actually, in your chest. Like recognition." The Day 3 night footage is disturbing. Marcus doesn't even pretend to maintain scientific objectivity anymore. He sits in the darkness with his headphones on, and his whole body sways slightly rhythmically, like he's moving to music only he can hear. At one point, he removes the headphones and tries to explain to the camera what he's experiencing, but his words don't quite make sense. He talks about the sound having intention, about it responding to his presence. He says, "It knows I'm listening. It's adjusting, showing me more because I'm ready to understand. I'm so close now. So close to hearing what it really is." His face in the lamplight looks gaunt, almost feverish. The footage shows him putting the headphones back on. He doesn't take them off again for the rest of the recording. He just sits there, swaying, occasionally smiling, until the camera's battery dies and the screen goes black. Day 4, dark. October 12th, that arrived. The final footage. Marcus hasn't slept in at least 48 hours, possibly longer. He looks like a different person from the confident young man who hiked into these mountains less than a week earlier. His hair is wild, his eyes have a glassy, faraway quality, but he's not agitated. He's calm, eerily calm. The camera is handheld now, shaking slightly as he films himself. He speaks quietly, intimately, like he's sharing a secret. He says, "I understand now why people don't come back, why they walk away from their old lives. How could you return after hearing something so beautiful? How could ordinary existence ever be enough again?" He talks about how he was wrong to try to debunk it, wrong to approach it as a skeptic. The sound isn't a phenomenon to be explained. It's communication. It's invitation. And tonight, he says, he's going to follow it to its source. The final sequence begins at 9:37 at night. Marcus has set up his main camera on the tripod again, positioned to capture a wide shot of his campsite. His smartphone is propped against a rock, filming from a different angle. He has his headphones on, connected to his microphone array. The professional audio recorder is running, capturing everything. He stands in the center of the frame, arms at his sides, face tilted up toward the sky. And then, audibly on the recording, it begins. The sound of gold rain. That cascading, metallic, impossible sound washing through the darkness. Marcus's reaction is immediate. His whole body responds like he's been touched. He brings his hands up to the headphones, holding them tight against his ears. His mouth opens, and he starts to cry, but these aren't tears of confusion or fear like on day 2. These are tears of pure joy, overwhelming and absolute. He's sobbing and laughing at the same time. He turns toward the camera, looks directly into the lens, and says, "It's real. Oh God, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. You can't understand. You can't know until you hear it properly. It's alive. It's conscious. And it's calling me. I have to go. I have to see what's making this. I have to know." And then Marcus Webb walks out of frame, just steps out of the pool of lamplight, and disappears into the darkness. The camera keeps recording. His phone keeps recording. The professional audio equipment keeps running, microphones pointed out into the black forest. For 6 hours and 14 minutes, the equipment captures that sound. The gold rain, falling in waves, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading to barely perceptible, but never completely stopping. No other sounds. No footsteps returning. No voice calling out. Just that cascading metallic rain, pouring through the darkness until the first gray light of dawn begins to filter through the trees. And then it stops. Suddenly. Completely. Like someone closed a door. The search began on October 14th when Marcus failed to check in with his roommate as scheduled. Search and rescue teams found his campsite exactly as he'd left it. The camera still on its tripod. Thumb still propped against its rock, battery dead, but memory card intact. The professional recorder still running, only stopped because its battery finally gave out. His sleeping bag, his food, his satellite beacon, all there. Marcus's wallet with his ID, his car keys, his backpack, everything except Marcus himself. They searched for 3 weeks, brought in dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging equipment. They covered a 20-mile radius from his campsite. They found nothing. No tracks leading away into the forest. No signs of animal predation. No indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. Marcus Webb had simply vanished, walked into the darkness, and never returned. But we have what he recorded, and that's where the true horror lives. The footage was released to the public after the investigation reached its inevitable conclusion: disappearance under unknown circumstances, presumed dead. Marcus's family hoped that making the recordings public might generate leads, might bring forward witnesses who'd seen something. Instead, it sparked a wave of analysis, both professional and amateur, that has only deepened the mystery. Dr. Raymond Chen, an audio forensic specialist at MIT, was the first credentialed expert to publish findings. He analyzed the sound that Marcus's equipment captured during those final 6 hours. His report is publicly available, and its conclusions are unsettling. The sound does not match any known natural phenomena. It contains regular, repeating patterns that suggest organization rather than randomness. The frequency spectrum is unusual, spanning from deep infrasonic rumbles around 7 Hz up through the audible range and into ultrasonic frequencies above 20,000 Hz. Most disturbing, Dr. Chen confirmed what Marcus had apparently discovered on his own. Beneath all the layers, running through the entire recording like a baseline rhythm, there is a pulse. A regular repeating throb that occurs at approximately 60 beats per minute. The frequency and pattern, Dr. Chen noted, are consistent with a human heartbeat. But here's what keeps audio analysts up at night. When Dr. Chen compared the sound Marcus recorded to the audio from the 1933 Hayes expedition, the crackling, barely audible fragments captured on wax cylinder nearly a century ago, they matched. Despite the massive difference in recording quality and technology, the underlying frequency patterns are identical. He then compared both to the audio from the various YouTube videos posted by hikers over the years. Same patterns. Same impossible sound, recorded across 85 years, on completely different equipment, in slightly different locations throughout the San Mateo range. Whatever is generating this sound, it's consistent. It's stable, and it's been there for at least a century, possibly longer. Possibly much longer. Dr. Chen's report included one more detail that rarely gets mentioned in casual discussions of the case. When he isolated and amplified the heartbeat-like pulse running beneath the gold rain sound, he noticed something. The pulse isn't perfectly steady. It exhibits subtle variations, small changes in timing and intensity. These variations, he wrote, are similar to what you'd observe in a living heartbeat responding to stimuli, as if whatever is producing this rhythm is reacting to something. Responding, breathing, alive. There's a moment in Marcus's final video, right before he walks off camera, that I keep returning to. It's brief, easy to miss if you're not watching closely. He's standing there, tears streaming down his face, headphones pressed to his ears. And for just a second, maybe 2, his expression changes. The joy flickers. Something else crosses his face. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. Like he's seen something or understood something that changes the context of everything. And then it's gone, replaced again by that overwhelming ecstatic joy. But in that flicker, you can see the Marcus who hiked into those mountains 4 days earlier, the rational skeptic with his scientific equipment and his reasonable hypotheses. You can see him realize what's actually happening. And then you watch him choose to walk forward anyway, into the darkness, toward the source of that beautiful, impossible sound. Marcus Webb's case remains officially unsolved. He is still listed as a missing person. His family holds out hope, though it's been over 5 years now. The San Mateo Mountains are still open to hikers, though the Forest Service has posted warnings about the Red Canyon area. Not because of the gold rain phenomenon, they can't officially acknowledge something like that. The warnings cite dangerous terrain, limited cell service, and the need for experienced hikers only. But everyone knows what they really mean. People still go looking. Every year, someone decides they're going to be the one to solve this mystery, to find out what Marcus found. Some come back with nothing. Some come back with recordings that may or may not capture ambiguous sounds in the night. And some, like James Whitmore in 1967, and like Marcus Webb in 2018, don't come back at all. The mountains keep them, along with their questions and their equipment, and their final moments of understanding something the rest of us can only imagine. The sound is still there. People report hearing it. The gold rain, falling through darkness, in a place where rain shouldn't sound like that. Where rain shouldn't fall to a rhythm like a heartbeat. And somewhere in those mountains, maybe, Marcus Webb is still listening. Still following that sound to wherever it leads. Still searching for its source with the dedication of a scientist and the devotion of a believer. Still walking deeper into a mystery that welcomed him home. The summer heat of 2022 shimmered across the New Mexico desert like liquid glass, distorting the horizon into waves of impossible light. It was in this season that the Peterson family vanished. 4 ordinary people from Boulder, Colorado, who had become infected with an extraordinary obsession. David and Margaret Peterson, both in their mid-40s, along with their teenage children, 17-year-old Emma and 15-year-old Connor, had spent the better part of 18 months researching something that most historians dismissed as pure fiction. They were hunting for Cibola, the legendary 7 cities of gold that had consumed conquistadors and dreamers for nearly 500 years. What made their disappearance different from the typical missing persons case wasn't just their obsession with an old legend. It was how they had prepared for their journey. Digital forensic investigators would later discover that David Peterson had been active on several dark web forums dedicated to what participants called Cibola tourism. These weren't the harmless conspiracy theory boards that populate the surface internet. These were encrypted channels where people shared coordinates, audio recordings, and increasingly disturbing testimonies about finding something in the desert that matched no known archaeological site. The family had purchased specialized equipment, thermal imaging cameras, audio recording devices capable of capturing infrasound, and soil testing kits more suited to a scientific expedition than a family vacation. They left Boulder on July 14, 2022, telling neighbors they were visiting National Park. The last confirmed sighting was at a gas station in Grants, New Mexico, where security footage showed all 4 family members purchasing water, trail mix, and strangely, 7 identical red bandanas. The clerk remembered them because Emma, the older daughter, had asked if they sold earplugs. When asked why, she'd simply smiled and said they were going somewhere loud. The clerk thought this was odd, given they were heading into one of the quietest regions of the American Southwest. 12 days passed with no contact. By day 13, Margaret's sister filed a missing persons report. Their rental vehicle was discovered on day 15, parked at an unmarked pullout along a remote fire road, approximately 43 miles southwest of Grants. Inside the vehicle, investigators found something that turned a missing persons case into something far stranger. The family's cell phones were arranged in a perfect circle on the dashboard, all powered on, all displaying the same image, a historical map from 1542, showing Coronado's supposed route to the 7 cities of Cibola. Each phone's screen was set to maximum brightness, and all had been playing the same audio file on loop. The batteries had long since died, but when forensic technicians recovered and played the file, it was 27 seconds of what sounded like wind moving through metal pipes, creating a rising and falling tone that several investigators later reported gave them headaches. Search and rescue teams deployed immediately, using the vehicle location as their starting point. The terrain was brutal, a mixture of high desert scrubland, volcanic rock formations, and areas where the earth itself seemed tortured, twisted into shapes that defied easy explanation. For 3 days, teams found nothing. No footprints, no discarded water bottles, no trace of 4 people who should have left some evidence of their passage. It was on the 4th day of searching, day 19 since the family's disappearance, that Park Ranger Carlos Mendez and his partner, Ranger Jennifer Wu, made the discovery. They had pushed further south than previous search patterns, following a hunch that Mendez later couldn't quite explain. He would tell investigators that the area they were searching felt wrong somehow, that his handheld GPS unit kept losing signal, and that the desert silence in that particular valley was so complete, it made his ears ring. The body camera footage from that day has been studied by everyone from psychologists to audio specialists, and it remains one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in the entire case. The video shows Mendez and Wu cresting a low ridge of black volcanic rock at approximately 3:17 in the afternoon. The temperature was 106 degrees, and there, in a shallow depression, surrounded by scraggly juniper trees that looked half dead from drought, were the Petersons. All 4 were sitting cross-legged on the bare earth, positioned at the corners of a perfect square approximately 12 feet on each side. They sat facing inward toward the center of the square, their backs rigid, hands resting on their knees in a pose that would have looked meditative if not for the wrongness of everything else. Their exposed skin was severely sunburned, peeling in sheets. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Their eyes were open but unfocused, staring at the center of their formation with an intensity that suggested they were seeing something the cameras couldn't capture. Wu's voice on the body cam audio is professional but strained. She calls out to the family, identifying herself as a park ranger. None of them react. Not a blink, not a twitch, Not the slightest acknowledgement that they've heard her voice. Mendez approaches slowly, calling their names one by one. Still nothing. It's only when Wu steps inside the perimeter of their square formation that she stops abruptly, her sharp intake of breath clearly audible on the recording. Surrounding the family, arranged in a specific geometric pattern, were 7 holes dug into the hard desert earth. The holes were roughly circular, each approximately 2 feet in diameter and appearing to be several feet deep. They were positioned in a pattern that would later be matched, with unnerving accuracy, to historical maps purporting to show the locations of Cibola's 7 cities. But what stopped Wu in her tracks wasn't the arrangement of the holes. It was the Peterson family's fingers. All 4 of them had fingers worn down to bloody stumps, nails torn away, tips scraped raw against rock and soil. The earth around each of the 7 holes was stained dark with dried blood. There were no shovels, no tools of any kind. The family had dug these holes with their bare hands, tearing through 2 feet of compacted desert soil mixed with volcanic rock. Medical examiners would later determine that this would have taken hours, possibly days, of continuous digging. The pain would have been extraordinary. Mendez's body cam footage shows him kneeling beside David Peterson, checking for a pulse, finding it weak but steady. He snaps his fingers in front of David's eyes. No response. He gently lifts David's ruined hand to examine the damage, and David doesn't react to what should be agonizing pain. Wu is on her radio calling for immediate medical evacuation, her voice rising with stress when the thing happens that turns the footage from disturbing to genuinely terrifying. Emma Peterson speaks, but her lips don't move. Her jaw doesn't open. The voice seems to come from her, yet not from her mouth. It's flat, effectless, carrying across the desert silence with crystalline clarity. The audio analysis would later show that the voice originates from Emma's location, but possesses acoustic properties that shouldn't be possible from a human throat. Too resonant, too perfectly modulated, as if multiple voices were speaking in absolute unison. The words she speaks are captured with perfect clarity on both Ranger's body cam systems. We heard the rain. We found the cities. They're not gold. They're golden. There's a difference. Wu spins toward Emma, her hand instinctively moving to her sidearm before training overrides panic. Emma hasn't moved. Her lips remain sealed, her posture unchanged, her eyes still fixed on the center of the square. Wu asks Emma to repeat what she said, voice shaking despite her professional composure. Silence. Just the wind moving through the dying junipers, and a sound that Mendez would later describe as humming, though the body cam audio requires significant amplification to detect it. All 4 family members are producing a low-frequency tone, barely audible, perfectly synchronized. The medical evacuation took 45 minutes to arrive. During that time, neither Ranger could convince any of the Petersons to respond to questions, to drink water, or to move from their positions. When the paramedics finally arrived and began physically moving them onto stretchers, the family members didn't resist, but also didn't help. They remained rigid, maintaining their seated posture even when lifted, their eyes never wavering from that empty center point of their square formation. It was only later, when the forensic team arrived to document the scene, that the additional disturbing details emerged. The 7 holes had been measured and mapped with precision. They formed a pattern matching a 1543 Spanish map of the supposed Cibola locations, accurate to within inches when scaled to the size of the square formation. More disturbing was what happened when investigators attempted to take soil samples from inside the holes. Standard magnetic compasses malfunctioned within the perimeter of the square. The needles would spin wildly or point in impossible directions. Electronic compasses fared no better, displaying error messages or conflicting readings. GPS units lost signal lock. One investigator reported that his smartphone spontaneously rebooted 3 times while standing in the center of the formation. The malfunction zone was precise, extending roughly 15 feet in all directions from the center point, but no further. But the detail that attracted the attention of botanists and soil scientists was even stranger. Within weeks of the family's rescue, research teams from 3 universities descended on the site. They attempted to understand why plant life wouldn't grow in the 7 holes the Petersons had dug. Local desert vegetation, Hardy species adapted to extreme conditions would sprout and grow normally in the soil surrounding the holes. But seeds planted inside any of the 7 holes simply wouldn't germinate. Transplanted shrubs would wither within days. Soil samples sent to laboratories showed no chemical contamination, no radiation, no obvious explanation for the sterility. One botanist, Dr. Sarah Chen from New Mexico State University, conducted an experiment where she planted genetically identical seedlings in pots filled with soil from inside the holes and soil from 5 feet away. The control plants thrived. The plants in soil from the holes died within 72 hours, displaying cellular breakdown that Chen described as inconsistent with any known pathogen or toxin. She noted in her report that the plant cells appeared to have simply stopped functioning, as if something in the soil convinced them that growth was impossible. Meanwhile, the Peterson family remained in psychiatric care at a secure facility in Albuquerque. Their physical injuries healed within weeks. Malnutrition was addressed, severe sunburn treated, ruined fingers bandaged and monitored as they slowly regenerated damaged tissue. But their minds didn't return. All 4 remained catatonic months after their rescue, responsive only to basic stimuli. They eat when fed, sleep on regular schedules, and maintain basic hygiene with assistance. But they don't speak, don't acknowledge visitors, and don't respond to their names. Neurological scans show normal brain activity. There's no physical damage to explain their condition. They simply appear to have withdrawn into some interior space from which they choose not to return. But they do continue to hum. That same low-frequency tone, barely audible, produced continuously except during sleep. The psychiatric staff found it disturbing enough that the family had to be isolated in soundproofed rooms. The humming tone was recorded and analyzed. The frequency matched, with remarkable precision, anomalous sounds found in dozens of audio recordings made over the years in various parts of the New Mexico desert. The same frequency appeared in recordings made by 1980s researchers, in audio captured by hikers in 2007, and in the file that had been playing on loop in the Peterson family's abandoned vehicle. Perhaps most disturbing is what happened 3 months into their hospitalization. Emma Peterson, still catatonic, still humming, picked up a crayon during supervised recreation time. Without breaking her 1,000-yard stare, without pausing her continuous humming, she drew on a piece of paper. The drawing showed 7 circles arranged in a specific pattern, surrounding a perfect square containing 4 smaller dots. It was an exact overhead representation of the scene where they'd been found. Then she drew something else. 7 circles connected by lines forming a larger pattern, with strange symbols inside each circle that matched no known writing system. When researchers compared her drawing to historical documents, they found something that stopped them cold. The symbols bore striking similarity to marginalia found in a 1544 letter written by a Spanish priest traveling with Coronado's expedition. The priest, who was later recalled to Mexico City and confined to a monastery where he died under suspicious circumstances, had written in his final correspondence about 7 doorways that were not gold, but golden, describing light that fell upward instead of down and rain that burned without fire. The Peterson family remains in care today. Hospital staff report that on certain nights, always during the new moon, all 4 will simultaneously stop humming for exactly 27 seconds before resuming. The silence, nurses say, is worse than the sound. During those 27 seconds, compasses throughout the entire psychiatric ward malfunction. Lights flicker. And sometimes, though this remains officially unconfirmed, staff members report hearing what sounds like distant rain falling in rooms with sealed windows, falling upward against the ceiling, leaving no trace of moisture but filling the air with a smell like burning copper and honey. The 7 holes in the desert remain. They've been covered, filled in, marked off limits. But the earth won't hold what's put back into them. Soil dumped into the holes simply disappears within days, leaving the same 2-foot-deep voids. The same perfect circles. The same sterile earth where nothing will grow and compasses spin in confused circles, searching for north in a place where perhaps that direction has lost all meaning. The pattern appeared again last spring, just outside Alamogordo, New Mexico. A wildlife biologist reviewing thermal footage of desert bighorn sheep heard it embedded in the audio track. She wasn't listening for anything unusual. She was counting animal calls, measuring population density, doing ordinary scientific work. But it was woven into the ambient sound like a thread she couldn't unsee once she'd noticed it. The same descending frequency sequence. The same rhythm that's been appearing in recordings across the Southwest for years now. Always moving. Always elsewhere. Never staying long enough to be properly studied. This is how the Cibola frequency travels. Not through the air where human ears might catch it in real time, but through recordings, through playback, through the deliberate act of listening. It hides in plain sight, waiting for attention, waiting for someone to care enough to hear. We know this because it happened to us too. During location scouting for this documentary, our crew spent 3 days in the Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix. We were filming background footage, capturing atmosphere, recording ambient sound for possible use in the final production. The days were hot and bright. We heard wind, birds, the distant rumble of thunder over the peaks. Nothing unusual. Nothing that made us stop and wonder. We packed up our equipment, drove back to the city, and began reviewing the footage. That's when production assistant Sarah Chen noticed something in hour 2 of the mountain recording. A pattern in the sound. She isolated it, cleaned it up, ran it through audio analysis software. The frequency signature matched perfectly with the recordings we'd collected from other witnesses. We had captured the Cibola frequency ourselves, in our own footage, and none of us had heard it while we were there. It only existed for us in playback, in the act of listening back, of paying attention. 3 members of our crew have since reported dreaming about golden cities. One quit the production entirely, saying he needed to drive through Arizona, that he couldn't explain why, but something was pulling him west. We haven't heard from him in 2 months. This is the nature of what we're dealing with. A phenomenon that spreads through listening, that propagates through attention, that seems to select for certain minds and leave others untouched. The wildlife biologist who heard it in her sheep recordings has listened to the frequency over 60 times now. She says she's looking for patterns within the pattern, meanings within the meaning. Her colleagues say she's become obsessed, that she talks about coordinates and forgotten Spanish maps, that she's planning an expedition into the Cabeza Prieta Desert where no expedition should go. She's not alone. We've now documented over 200 individuals who have heard the Cibola frequency in various forms. Hikers who recorded video near old mining claims. Paranormal investigators who captured audio in abandoned towns. A sound engineer in Tucson who found it embedded in a client's demo tape. A professor in Albuquerque who discovered it in archival recordings from 1937. Each of them reports the same thing. They didn't hear it in the moment. Only later. Only when listening back. Only when paying attention. And once they've heard it, something changes. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like a compass needle swinging toward magnetic north. They feel a pull. Westward usually, toward empty places, toward regions where the old Spanish explorers searched for cities of gold, toward areas where conquistadors vanished and were never found. Some resist the pull. They stop listening to the recordings, delete the files, try to forget. Others give in. At least 17 people we've tracked have quit their jobs, sold their possessions, and disappeared into the desert Southwest, following something they can't quite articulate but insist they must find. Search and rescue teams have recovered 4 of them, dehydrated and disoriented, miles from the nearest road. The others remain missing. Is Cibola a place? That's the question we started with months ago when this investigation began. The historical evidence suggests it was a misunderstanding, a cultural mistranslation, a fantasy that never had any basis in reality. But the frequency keeps appearing. It moves from location to location, year after year, tracing a pattern across the Southwest that some researchers believe corresponds to old Spanish expedition routes. Others think it follows geological features, appearing near fault lines and mineral deposits where the Earth's natural electromagnetic field might interact with human consciousness in unexpected ways. Or perhaps Cibola is a frequency itself, not a place you can find on a map, but a state of perception, a wavelength of awareness that only certain people can access under certain conditions. This theory, proposed by several parapsychologists we've consulted, suggests that the sound acts as a carrier wave for information encoded centuries ago. By whom, for what purpose, they can't say. but they point to the specificity of the effect. Only those seeking gold, or those who listen intentionally to recordings, seem to be affected. Casual listeners, people who hear the frequency played in the background without knowing what they're hearing, report nothing unusual. It's the act of seeking, the intention of listening, that opens the door. This implies something unsettling. That belief itself might be the mechanism. That the frequency works because people think it works, because they've been primed to hear meaning in randomness, to find patterns in noise. But that explanation doesn't account for the consistency of the reports. It doesn't explain why people dream of the same architectural details, describe the same golden spires, speak of the same sense of calling. If it's just suggestion and expectation, why such uniformity across so many witnesses who had no contact with each other before hearing the frequency? Some believe Cibola exists between sound and belief, in a liminal space where human consciousness intersects with something older than modern understanding. This explanation satisfies no one and explains nothing, but it captures the essential strangeness of what we're dealing with, a phenomenon that refuses to fit into conventional categories. Not quite supernatural, not quite natural, somewhere in between, at the edges of what we can measure and study. The frequency appeared again 2 weeks ago, this time near Silver City, New Mexico. A geology student recorded it while documenting rock formations. Before that, it was outside Flagstaff. Before that, Roswell. It moves faster now, appearing more frequently, in more recordings. The pattern is accelerating, spreading, touching more people each year. Why? We don't know. Where will it appear next? We can't predict. What happens to the people who follow its call into the desert? Most return confused and empty-handed. Some don't return at all. You've been listening to this documentary, following this investigation, hearing these stories. You've been told about the frequency, its effects, its victims. And now, you need to understand something. In presenting this evidence, in playing these recordings, in analyzing this sound, we've exposed you to it too. Every person who watches this documentary, who hears the audio we've included, who listens carefully to the witness testimony and the expert analysis, has now been touched by the Cibola frequency. You are part of the pattern now. You are one of the 200, or 300, or however many there are by the time you hear these words. We don't know what that means for you. Maybe nothing. Maybe you'll forget about this documentary as soon as it ends. Go about your life. Never think about golden cities or mysterious frequencies again. That's what most people do. They hear it, they move on. They remain unaffected. But some don't. Some can't. Some will lie in bed tonight and hear that descending tone sequence playing in their memory. Some will dream of spires catching sunset light, of streets paved with precious metal, of doorways leading into shadows that promise revelation. If you hear it in your sleep tonight, will you follow? That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.